Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief review of my lecture on Soren Kierkegaard as one of the early precursors to existential philosophy. In that lecture, I talked about Kierkegaard being one of the first writers to address this kind of new challenge of living in what we might call a postmodern moment, a moment where we have kind of a combination of unprecedented freedoms in many of our societies. Again, a kind of an imperfect expression of that, but an unprecedented historically level of freedom in societies that offer the individual choices with regard to their lives. And that combines with a kind of an unprecedented uncertainty with regard to many of the what were called the master narratives, or sort of overarching narratives that gave our lives direction and significance and coherence in earlier epochs. And so the sort of collapse throughout the modern of these master narratives combines with this sort of unprecedented level of freedom to generate this kind of postmodern challenge that I think somebody like Kierkegaard or Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century are beginning to speak to in meaningful ways. And certainly by the time you get into the 20th century and you get thinkers, like Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and others, they're going to write about this, and it's going to really start to resonate more broadly as something that's true of our existential condition, the conditions of our existence, the conditions that are confronting living individuals in this moment in history. And so Kierkegaard, as I said in my lecture, characterizes the challenge of being a subject of a life and a concrete, unique individual in a life, having a life and trying to figure out a life as the confrontation of choices that are criterionless, that are choices that do not have objective criteria by which we can make these choices. Examples like to marry or not to marry, to study or not to study, more, to go to college, not to work, what kind of job, to have children, not. That there's no biology, psychology, mathematics, there's no science, there's no math, there's no philosophy that can tell you, whoever you are as an individual, whether you ought to do any of these things. The choices that will end up defining your existence are beyond these objective criteria. You're a subject, not an object, so objective truth is untruth, Kierkegaard says, and we all must confront criterionless choices. But the trouble with that is that, it's disturbing. It produces what Kierkegaard characterizes as a kind of a feeling of agony, what others would characterize as anxiety or existential angst. And so for that reason, many people look away from the challenge of being an authentic, unique individual, and they crowd together with others and they shout their answers to the questions of life with loud voices in unison, and pretend that because they're doing it in loud voices in unison, that somehow that makes them right. And Kierkegaard finds that a really inauthentic response to the challenge of existence, but nevertheless a painfully common response. And then in the lecture, I went on to describe the way in which Kierkegaard produces an analysis of how we might think about progression in an individual life that may lead us towards a more practical or useful response to, or the most useful response we can muster to the agony of criterionless choice as the sort of central experience of existence. And so I developed in the lecture the idea of the three stages on life's way, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And very briefly, the aesthetic approach to choice has to do with sort of chasing the next delightful or beautiful or pleasant experience. There's a wonderful spontaneity to it, but there's a kind of a rejection of the idea that choice really matters. It's kind of a whimsical approach to life. That has its downsides. It leads to a feeling of irresponsibility for a number of reasons. And so sometimes people swing a pendulum and they go from this kind of, whimsical approach to life characterized as the aesthetic, and they swing all the way over to some very serious approach to life that Kierkegaard characterized as the ethical, where we use our minds and our thinking and our rationality and our capacity for self-reflection and learning to try to find some worthwhile structure, set of principles to guide us in a kind of an attempted long-term linear project in our lives that will help us be good people, build virtuous character, have successful careers and families, etc. And there is certainly a strength to that, that does take choice more seriously. However, Kierkegaard says that the downside of the ethical approach to life, in some sense, at its heart, is that it attempts to find, in the form of some principles or a certain program for existence that we consistently adhere to, it attempts to find some kind of objective formula for a subjective life. And so we often sort of live our way out from under these programs that we commit ourselves to for periods of time. And maybe if we don't slip back into the aesthetic, we may progress to the third stage on life's way and get to an authentic religious experience of life, which again is not about following some religious crowd. It is about a very individual leap of faith that is not done once in order to follow a certain tradition or institution. It is done daily, where you take on life as if it is a quest for something near impossible. The more impossible, the better. In fact, in some sense, I think this is why Kierkegaard identifies so strongly with the Christian tradition and its symbolism. You have to try to find, as I like to put it, a way to combine your finite, mortal, time-bound self. You have to find a way to express that horizontal component with the infinite mystery of existence. I didn't talk about this, I didn't use this language in my original lecture on it, but I like to introduce a couple of new things in the reviews. You have to embrace the paradox that with your finite perspective, you can really know what God wants of your life. And, again, that there's this paradox, right? Because, as we did when we talked about Aquinas, even Aquinas recognized that the eternal law in the mind of God is forever beyond the human. So how can you, and I, as single individuals in a moment of history, here on this one planet of, in the vast universe, think that we can have some direct line to the cause of all existence in order to know what it wants from our life? Well, that's just the paradox that you need to generate what Kierkegaard thinks of as authentic faith. Faith is not about something you have evidence to believe in. In fact, it's beyond that, something that you have to will yourself to believe despite the paradoxical nature of it. And so if you can generate that sort of strength and choose to be and choose a quest, a project or a set of projects for your life, you may eventually become the knight of infinite faith. And I wish off the top of my head I could remember some, Kierkegaard has some beautiful language about the knight of infinite faith. I think he says the knights of infinite faith are the dancers, right? Like somehow they dance their way through existence. And there is the suggestion in that poetic language that it will be the knights of infinite faith who can wake up day after day, not saved by what somebody else may or may not have done, not saved by some kind of overly simple commitment to some metaphysical paradigm that we don't have any evidence for, but saved by the will that you have to choose your paradoxical quest for existence. And in the sense that you are saved, you have the best and most authentic response to the agony of criterionless choice. And so that's my reading on how Kierkegaard offers us a little bit of advice, albeit couched in the language of theism. And for many of us, even in the 21st century, we still think of our lives in this way. We utilize this vocabulary. And so we might find something interesting in Kierkegaardian in Kierkegaardian Christianity, or as I implied in my lecture, I think you can actually take Kierkegaard and even see him as saying something powerful about religious experience in general, beyond even the Christian paradigm. And that is that, you know, it's an increasingly individualistic experience in the now increasingly postmodern age. And do you have the will to do that daily leap of faith? And if you do, that will be the best response to the agony of existence. And this completes my short review of my lecture on Kierkegaard.